Welcome to the Marple Files, Miss Marple's home for solving captivating mysteries.
In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Hall, a scream pierces the night, and a woman vanishes without a trace. A locked door, a single pearl earring, a cryptic note scrawled with betrayal. What secrets lurk among the polished guests of this grand estate? Was it a jealous lover, a desperate debtor, or a friend hiding a deadly truth? Enter Miss Jane Marple, her keen eyes missing nothing, as she unravels a web of lies where loyalty masks treachery. Who can you trust when everyone has a secret? Music swells, a sharp violin sting. Join us for Travel Terror Unmasked, Miss Marple's Buddy Betrayal, a chilling mystery where every clue counts, and the truth is more shocking than you dare imagine. Chapter 1. The invitation to Blackthorn Hall. Late summer sun cast a golden haze over the rolling hills of Devon, where Blackthorn Hall stood like a sentinel of a bygone era. The grand estate, with its ivy-clad towers and mullioned windows, was a relic of Georgian splendor, nestled in a quiet valley where the world seemed to pause. To the villagers of nearby St. Mary's Mead, it was a place of whispered legends, tales of old wealth, older grudges, and secrets buried beneath polished floors. Yet, on this particular August afternoon in 1925, the hall buzzed with an unusual vitality. For Lady Beatrice Langley had summoned a select group of guests for a week-end retreat. Miss Jane Marple, with her soft white shawl draped over her shoulders, and her knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her lap, sat in the corner of the drawing room, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She had been invited, somewhat unexpectedly, by Lady Beatrice herself, a distant acquaintance from a charity committee years prior. Miss Marple, ever observant, suspected the invitation was not merely a gesture of kindness. There was a tension in Lady Beatrice's letter, a certain urgency beneath the elegant script, that piqued her curiosity, and so she had accepted, arriving by the afternoon train with her modest suitcase and an unassuming air that belied her keen mind. The drawing room was a study in contrasts, opulent yet faded, grand yet faintly melancholic. The guests, gathered around a silver tea service, were an eclectic mix, each polished in their manners but betraying, to Miss Marple's discerning eye, a hint of unease. Lady Beatrice, a tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a commanding presence, presided over the group with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her husband, Sir Reginald Langley, a retired colonel with a bristling mustache and a penchant for brandy, lounged by the fireplace, his laughter loud but forced. Their daughter, Clara Langley, a delicate beauty of 22, sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze darting toward the window as if expecting someone or something. Then there was Dr. Harold Grayson, a local physician, with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles, and his wife, Eleanor, whose sharp tongue and sharper wit made her both admired and feared. Mr. Victor Hammond, a London barrister with slicked-back hair and an air of self-assurance, sipped his tea with a smirk, as though privy to some private jest. His companion, Miss Sylvia Crane, a novelist of middling success, scribbled in a notebook, her eyes flitting about the room as if collecting material for her next book. Finally, there was young Peter Walsh, a distant cousin of the Langleys, whose boyish charm and easy smile seemed at odds with the faint tremor in his hands. As he accepted a biscuit, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a metronome to her thoughts. She noted the way Clara avoided her mother's gaze, the way Dr. Grayson's fingers twitched when his wife spoke, and the way Victor Hammond's smirk faltered when Sir Reginald mentioned the family's recent financial troubles. A temporary setback, Sir Reginald had boomed, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of worry. Miss Marple filed these observations away, her mind already weaving a tapestry of possibilities. The conversation turned to the purpose of the weekend, a celebration. Lady Beatrice announced of the Langley family's enduring legacy. "We have much to be grateful for," she said, her voice smooth but strained, "and I thought it fitting to gather our dearest friends to share in our joy." Yet, as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed Clara's lips tighten, and Peter Walsh's teacup clinked sharply against its saucer as the afternoon waned. The guests were shown to their rooms to prepare for dinner. Miss Marple, assigned a modest but comfortable chamber overlooking the rose garden, unpacked her few belongings with care. She paused at the window, her gaze settling on the gravel drive below, where a latecomer's car was pulling up a sleek black Daimler, its driver obscured by the gathering dusk. Something about the car's arrival sent a shiver through her, though she could not say why. Dinner was a formal affair, with candlelight glinting off crystal and silver. The conversation flowed, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of strain. Sir Reginald spoke at length about his military days, while Lady Beatrice steered the talk toward Clara's upcoming engagement to a certain Lord Ashford, a match that seemed to please no one but herself. Clara, pale and silent, barely touched her food. Victor Hammond, meanwhile, made pointed remarks about inheritances and family secrets, his words cloaked in humor but laced with venom. Miss Marple listened, her expression serene, but her mind cataloging every word, every glance. As the clock struck 9, a sudden scream pierced the air, sharp and chilling. The guests froze, forks suspended, eyes wide. It came from upstairs, a cry of terror that seemed to echo through the very walls of Blackthorn Hall. Sir Reginald leapt to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "Good God! What was that?" he demanded. Miss Marple set her napkin aside, her heart quickening but her demeanor calm. "Perhaps we should investigate," she suggested mildly, though her eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity. The others rose, some reluctantly, and followed Sir Reginald as he strode toward the staircase. In that moment, as the group ascended the grand stairs, Miss Marple knew that the weekend at Blackthorn Hall would be no ordinary gathering. Something dark had stirred, and she, with her unassuming presence and razor-sharp mind, was already beginning to unravel its threads. Chapter 2. The shadow in the corridor. Dorothy's scream still lingered in the air, a ghostly echo, as the guests of Blackthorn Hall hurried up the grand staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick crimson carpet. Sir Reginald Langley led the charge, his military bearing reasserting itself despite the brandy flush in his cheeks. Behind him, Lady Beatrice clutched her pearl necklace, her face pale but composed, while Clara Langley trailed behind, her delicate frame trembling. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped and her steps measured, followed at a discreet distance, her eyes scanning the flickering shadows cast by the wall sconces. The scream had come from the east wing, where the guest bedrooms were situated. As the group reached the landing, a housemaid, young and wide-eyed, stumbled toward them, her apron askew. "It's Miss Crane," she gasped, her voice quavering. She's gone." "Gone?" Sir Reginald barked, his mustache bristling. "What do you mean, girl? Speak plainly." The maid, whose name Miss Marple recalled was Jenny, wrung her hands. "I was turning down the beds, sir, when I heard her scream. I ran to her room, but the door was locked, and when I called out, there was no answer. I fetched Mr. Burrows, he's the butler, and he broke the door open. But she's not there. The window's open, and there's blood, sir." A collective gasp rippled through the group. Victor Hammond, the barrister, raised an eyebrow, his smirk replaced by a calculating frown. "Blood, you say? This sounds rather theatrical," he remarked, though his tone lacked its usual bravado. Eleanor Grayson clutched her husband's arm, her sharp features taut with alarm, while Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles nervously. Peter Walsh, the young cousin, looked as though he might be sick, his boyish charm replaced by a pallor that matched Clara's. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, stepped forward. "Perhaps we should see the room for ourselves," she suggested, her voice gentle but firm. "Details are so important in such matters, are they not?" Sir Reginald grunted his assent, and the group followed Jenny to Miss Sylvia Crane's room at the end of the corridor. The door hung ajar, its lock splintered from the butler's efforts. Inside, the room was a scene of disarray. The bed was neatly made, but a chair lay overturned near the window, which gaped open to the night air. A faint breeze stirred the curtains, and on the polished floorboards, a small smear of blood glistened in the lamplight, a stark crimson against the wood. Miss Marple's eyes darted about the room, taking in every detail. The open notebook on the writing desk, its pages fluttering slightly. The single pearl earring on the floor near the bed, glinting like a misplaced star. The faint scent of lavender perfume lingering in the air. She noted the absence of Miss Crane's handbag, which had been slung over her shoulder during tea, and the curious fact that the window latch was undamaged, suggesting it had been opened deliberately. Dr. Grayson, kneeling by the blood stain, frowned. "It's fresh," he said, his voice clinical but unsteady. "Not much, but enough to suggest injury. A cut, perhaps, or a blow." He glanced at the window, which overlooked a steep drop to the gravel drive below. If she fell or was pushed, it would be a miracle if she survived. "Nonsense," Victor Hammond interjected, his voice sharp. Sylvia was a dramatist, always scribbling her little stories. "This is probably some stunt to inspire her next novel. She'll turn up in the morning, laughing at us all." Clara Langley, who had been silent, suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wouldn't do that. Sylvia was afraid. I saw it in her eyes at dinner. She kept looking at the door, as if she expected someone to come through it." Miss Marple turned to Clara, her expression kindly but probing. "Afraid, you say? Miss Langley, did she confide in you? Perhaps a word, a hint of what troubled her?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the lace of her dress. "No, not exactly. But she asked me this afternoon if I ever felt watched. I thought it was just her imagination. But now—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked away, her eyes glistening. Lady Beatrice, regaining her composure, clapped her hands sharply. "Enough of this speculation. We must search the grounds at once. Reginald, organize the staff. Mr. Hammond, Dr. Grayson, will you assist? Clara, stay here with Mrs. Grayson and Miss Marple." Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the role of bystander, though her mind was anything but idle. As the men dispersed, she approached the writing desk, her fingers brushing the edge of Sylvia's notebook. A single word caught her eye, scrawled in hasty ink: "Betrayal." Beneath it, a time was noted: 8:45 p.m., just minutes before the scream. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The notebook, she decided, would bear closer scrutiny. But not now, not with so many eyes about. Eleanor Grayson, standing by the door, muttered, "This is absurd. Sylvia was always so dramatic. Probably ran off with some secret lover and staged this for attention." Her tone was scornful, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands trembled. betraying her bravado. The search of the grounds yielded nothing. The gravel drive showed no signs of a fall, and the rose garden below the window was undisturbed. By midnight, the local constable, a stout man named Inspector Hargreaves, had arrived, his notebook already filled with hasty scribbles. He surveyed the room, listened to Jenny's account, and declared it a case of possible foul play. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner, offered no opinion, though her mind was alight with questions. As the household retired, uneasy and whispering, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her eyes tracing the shadows. She recalled the black Daimler she had seen arriving at dusk, its driver still unknown. She thought of Clara's words about Sylvia's fear, of the single earring, the open window, the word betrayal. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing patterns where others saw chaos, knew that these threads would soon weave a picture dark, perhaps, but clear. She returned to her room, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. Tomorrow, she would speak with each guest, observe their words and silences, and begin to unravel the mystery of Blackthorn Hall. For now, she sat by the window, the night air cool against her cheek, and let her little gray cells work. In the quiet. Chapter 3. The Rival of Inquiry. The morning sun filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of Blackthorn Hall, casting a pale glow over the breakfast room where the guests gathered in uneasy silence. The events of the previous night hung over the table like a storm cloud, dampening even Sir Reginald's usual bluster. The clink of porcelain and the soft rustle of newspapers were the only sounds, save for the occasional murmur between Lady Beatrice and the butler, Mr. Burrows, who moved about with a grim efficiency. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her tea and a slice of toast, observed the group with her customary quiet attentiveness, her knitting resting in her lap like a trusted companion. The absence of Miss Sylvia Crane was palpable. Her empty chair at the table seemed to accuse each guest in turn, and Miss Marple noted the way their eyes avoided it. Clara Langley, pale and drawn, toyed with her spoon, her breakfast untouched. Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, a nervous tic that betrayed his unease, while his wife, Eleanor, maintained a brittle composure, her sharp gaze darting from face to face. Victor Hammond, the barrister, appeared unruffled, buttering his toast with deliberate care, though Miss Marple caught the fleeting tightness in his jaw when Sir Reginald mentioned the police. Young Peter Walsh, meanwhile, looked as though he had barely slept, his boyish features shadowed by a restless anxiety. Inspector Hargreaves had promised to return by mid-morning with reinforcements, but the household was not idle in his absence. Lady Beatrice, ever the hostess, had insisted on maintaining decorum, though her strained smile betrayed her effort. "We must carry on," she said, her voice firm but thin. "Sylvia will surely be found, and we must not let this unfortunate incident disrupt our weekend." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind alert. She had risen early, before the household stirred, and taken a quiet walk around the grounds. The gravel drive beneath Sylvia's window showed no fresh marks, confirming the search party's findings from the previous night. The rose garden, too, was pristine, its thorns unmarred by any sign of struggle. Yet, as she had passed the garage, she had glimpsed the black Daimler again, its hood gleaming in the dawn light. The driver, she learned from a discreet inquiry to Jenny the housemaid, was a Mr. Lawrence Kendall, a late rival and old friend of Sir Reginald's, who had retired to his room immediately upon arriving and was not present at dinner. Miss Marple filed this away, her curiosity piqued by his absence during the critical hours of Sylvia's disappearance. As breakfast concluded, a knock at the front door announced the arrival of Inspector Hargreaves, accompanied by a young sergeant, and, to Miss Marple's quiet satisfaction, a familiar figure, Captain Arthur Hastings. Hastings, with his earnest demeanor and military neatness, had been summoned by the inspector, who valued his local connections and good sense. Miss Marple, who had met Hastings on a previous case, greeted him with a warm smile, noting the flicker of relief in his eyes at seeing a familiar face. "Miss Marple," Hastings said, bowing slightly, "I hadn't expected to find you here, but I'm glad of it. This business with Miss Crane is most peculiar." "Indeed, Captain Hastings," she replied, her voice soft but sharp with interest. "Peculiar, and perhaps more complex than it first appears. Have you spoken with the inspector?" Hastings nodded, guiding her to a quiet corner of the hall where Inspector Hargreaves was conferring with Sir Reginald. The inspector, a stout man with a no-nonsense air, was outlining his plan: a thorough search of the house and grounds, interviews with each guest and staff member, and an examination of Sylvia's room for further clues. "We're treating this as a possible abduction," he said gruffly, "though murder isn't off the table. That blood stain is troubling, and the locked door suggests foul play." Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly over her knitting. "A locked door is indeed curious," she remarked, "but one must consider how it was locked and why. Was it to keep someone in, or to keep others out?" Hargreaves raised an eyebrow, clearly unused to such musings from an elderly spinster, but Hastings gave her an encouraging nod. "Quite right, Miss Marple, and that open window most suspicious. It's a 20-foot drop, with no ladder or trellis to aid a descent." The morning was spent in methodical inquiry. Hargreaves and his sergeant interviewed the staff, while Hastings accompanied Miss Marple as she discreetly observed the guests. She began with Clara, who was found in the conservatory, staring blankly at a potted fern. "Miss Langley," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned last night that Miss Crane seemed afraid. Can you recall anything else she said? Perhaps about her work or her plans?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. She spoke of her novel. She said at last. She said it was her best yet, but that it might make people angry. She wouldn't say why, only that it was based on truth. Too much truth, she called it. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Truth can be a dangerous thing, Miss Langley." "Did she mention anyone in particular? A name, perhaps?" Clara shook her head, but her gaze flickered toward the door, where Victor Hammond was passing. Miss Marple noted this, her mind turning to the barrister's sharp remarks at dinner about family secrets. She thanked Clara and moved on, her steps light but purposeful. Next, she spoke with Dr. Grayson, who was found in the library, leafing through a medical journal with feigned interest. "Dr. Grayson," she began, "you examined the blood stain last night. Could it have been staged? Do you think? A small cut, perhaps, to create an impression?" The doctor adjusted his spectacles, his face flushing. "It's possible," he admitted. "The amount was small, consistent with a superficial wound. But why stage such a thing? Unless—" He trailed off, his eyes darting to his wife, who was across the room, speaking animatedly with Lady Beatrice. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Unless someone wished to mislead us," she finished for him. She made a mental note of his unease, recalling Eleanor Grayson's dismissive words about Sylvia's dramatic nature. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple's observations grew sharper. She noted Peter Walsh's reluctance to meet her gaze. The way Victor Hammond's confident demeanor faltered when asked about his last conversation with Sylvia, and the curious fact that Mr. Lawrence Kendall, the mysterious latecomer, had yet to appear. She returned to Sylvia's room, where the notebook still lay open on the desk. The word betrayal stared up at her, and beside it, a faint smudge of ink suggested a hurried hand. Hastings joined her, his brow furrowed. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple? This notebook, the blood, the locked door, it's all so theatrical. Yet there's something deliberate about it." "Deliberate, indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but certain. "Every detail matters, Captain Hastings. The question is not only what happened to Miss Crane, but why someone wished us to believe it happened in this way." As the clock struck noon, Inspector Hargreaves called the household together in the drawing room. "We've found no trace of Miss Crane," he announced, his tone grim. "But we've a new development. A groundskeeper reports seeing a figure near the east wing last night, just before the scream. A man, he thinks, though it was too dark to be sure." A murmur rippled through the group, and Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A man. A locked door. A word scrawled in haste. The threads were multiplying, and she was beginning to see their pattern. For now, she would watch, listen, and let her little gray cells work their quiet magic. Chapter 4. The Art of Observation. Drawing room of Blackthorn Hall, with its heavy velvet curtains and gleaming mahogany, was suffused with a tense hush as Inspector Hargreaves concluded his announcement. The mention of a mysterious figure near the east wing had set the guests on edge, their faces a gallery of unease, suspicion, and guarded secrets. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, watched the interplay of glances with the keenness of a naturalist observing a rare species. Captain Hastings stood beside her, his honest face creased with concern, his notebook open as he jotted down the inspector's words. Inspector Hargreaves, his stout frame imposing despite his rumpled suit, cleared his throat. "We'll need statements from everyone present," he declared, his eyes sweeping the room. "Where you were at precisely 9 p.m. last night, when the scream was heard. No detail is too small. Sergeant Davies will take your accounts one by one in the library." As the guests murmured their assent, Miss Marple noted the subtle shifts in their postures. Sir Reginald Langley, standing by the fireplace, puffed out his chest as if to assert his authority, but his fingers gripped his brandy glass a fraction too tightly. Lady Beatrice, arranging a vase of roses with studied precision, avoided her daughter's gaze. Clara Langley, pale as ever, sat with her hands clasped, her eyes fixed on the carpet as if it held answers. Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles yet again, while Eleanor Grayson's lips curved in a faint, disdainful smile. Victor Hammond leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his expression one of detached amusement, though Miss Marple caught the flicker of calculation in his eyes. Peter Walsh, meanwhile, seemed to shrink into himself, his boyish charm eroded by a nervous twitch in his jaw. And then there was Mr. Lawrence Kendall, the latecomer whose black Daimler had caught Miss Marple's attention. He had finally appeared. At breakfast, a lean man in his 40s with sharp features and a reserved manner, his dark eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. He had offered little conversation, claiming fatigue from his journey, but Miss Marple sensed a watchfulness in him that mirrored her own. As the guests dispersed to give their statements, Miss Marple requested a private word with Hastings. They retreated to the conservatory, where the air was thick with the scent of ferns and damp earth. "Captain Hastings," she began, her voice soft but deliberate. You have a good heart and a keen eye, but you must learn to see not only what is shown, but what is hidden. Tell me, what did you notice about the alibis being offered? Hastings frowned, consulting his notes. Well, they're all rather vague so far. Sir Reginald claims he was in the dining room, as we all were, when the scream occurred. Lady Beatrice says the same, though she mentioned stepping out to speak with the butler about dessert. Clara was at the table, but she says she felt faint and went to the powder room just before 9 o'clock. Dr. Grayson was also at dinner, but he admits to leaving briefly to fetch a headache powder from his room. Eleanor says she was with him, though she's hazy on the timing. Victor Hammond insists he never left the table, and Peter Walsh says he was fetching a glass of water from the sideboard. As for Mr. Kendall, he claims he was in his room, unpacking, and heard nothing until the commotion began. Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she considered this. A curious collection of alibis, Captain. Each one places them conveniently near the dining room, yet with just enough ambiguity to allow for movement. And Mr. Kendall, his absence during dinner is most interesting. Did you notice his cufflinks? Hastings blinked. Cufflinks? No, I can't say I did. They are silver, with an engraved initial, L.K., but one was missing its mate, replaced by a plain stud. A small detail, perhaps, but one does wonder how a man so meticulous in his appearance could misplace such an item. Hastings' eyes widened, and he scribbled a note. You think it's significant? Everything is significant, my dear Captain, until proven otherwise, Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. Now, let us visit Miss Crane's room again. I have a feeling we overlooked something in our haste last night. They found the room much as it had been, though the police had cordoned it off with a rope across the doorway. Inspector Hargreaves, preoccupied with interviewing the staff, permitted Miss Marple and Hastings to examine the scene, provided they touched nothing. The blood stain on the floor had dried to a dull brown, and the open window still admitted a faint breeze. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the notebook, where the word betrayal and the time 8:45 p.m. were scrawled. She bent closer, noting a faint crease in the page, as if something had been pressed against it. Captain, she said, pointing to the desk, do you see this smudge? It's not ink, but something else, wax, perhaps, or grease. And look here, at the edge of the desk. A scratch, fresh and deep, as if something heavy was dragged across it. Hastings peered at the mark, his brow furrowing. A suitcase, perhaps, or a weapon, perhaps, Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. But consider the earring we found last night, near the bed, a single pearl, separated from its twin, and now this scratch, and the wax, small things, but they tell a story. If we listen. They moved to the window, where Miss Marple examined the latch. No signs of forcing. She murmured, it was open from within, which suggests Miss Crane or someone else intended it to be so. But why? To escape, or to create the appearance of escape. As they left the room, they encountered Victor Hammond in the corridor, his hands in his pockets, and his expression one of studied nonchalance. Snooping, are we? He said, his tone light but edged. I'd have thought an old lady like you would leave this to the police, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. Oh, I find that observation is a habit of age, Mr. Hammond. One notices so much when one sits quietly. For instance, I noticed you were quite attentive to Miss Crane at tea yesterday. Did you know her well? Hammond's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. Hardly. She was an acquaintance, nothing more. A bit of a bore. Always scribbling in that notebook of hers. Probably got herself into trouble with one of her silly stories. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp. And yet, her notebook may tell us more than she intended. Good day, Mr. Hammond. As he walked away, Hastings whispered, he's hiding something, isn't he? Most certainly, Miss Marple replied. But then, my dear Captain, so are they all? The question is, whose secret led to Miss Crane's disappearance and why? By late afternoon, the interviews were complete, and Inspector Hargreaves gathered the household to share his findings. We've confirmed the alibis, such as they are, he said gruffly. But there's a gap between 8:45 and 9 p.m. Several of you were unaccounted for. And we've found something else. A handkerchief, monogrammed with the letter L, in the shrubbery beneath Miss Crane's window. It's being examined for traces of blood. A murmur of shock rippled through the group. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her mind turning to Lawrence Kendall and his missing cufflink. The threads of the mystery were tightening, and she sensed that the next clue would bring them closer to the truth or to a carefully laid trap. Chapter 5. The red herring's atmosphere in Blackthorn Hall had grown taut as a violin string by the afternoon, the weight of suspicion pressing upon every guest. The discovery of the monogrammed handkerchief, announced by Inspector Hargreaves, had sent a ripple of unease through the household, with glances darting toward those whose names began with L. Lady Beatrice Langley, Clara Langley, and the elusive Lawrence Kendall. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the library with her knitting, observed the undercurrents of fear and deflection with her usual quiet acuity. Captain Hastings, ever her loyal companion, hovered nearby, his notebook filled with scribbled observations. Though he confessed to Miss Marple that the case was beginning to feel like a maze, with no exit, Inspector Hargreaves, his face flushed with the exertion of his inquiries, had taken a particular interest in Lawrence Kendall. The mysterious latecomer, with his reserved demeanor and sharp eyes, had offered little to his alibi beyond a claim of being alone in his room, unpacking. At the time of Sylvia Crane's scream, the handkerchief, bearing the initial L, had cast a shadow over him, and Hargreaves was now questioning him in the study. The door ajar just enough for Miss Marple to catch fragments of their conversation. Kendall's voice was calm but clipped, insisting he had no handkerchief with that monogram and suggesting it might belong to one of the Langleys. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The handkerchief, she suspected, was a distraction, a red herring, deliberately placed to mislead. She had seen such tactics before, in the quiet intrigues of St. Mary's Mead, where a misplaced letter or a dropped glove could obscure a deeper truth. Her mind returned to the notebook in Sylvia's room, the word betrayal scrawled in haste, and the faint smudge of wax on the desk. These were not distractions, she felt certain, but keys to the puzzle. She turned to Hastings, her voice low. Captain, have you noticed how quick everyone is to point fingers? Mr. Kendall blames the Langleys. Mrs. Grayson accuses Miss Crane of staging her own disappearance, and Mr. Hammond suggests she ran off with a lover. Yet none of them offer a clear account of their own movements. Hastings nodded, flipping through his notes. It's as if they're all trying to muddy the waters. But that handkerchief, it's a solid clue, isn't it? And Kendall's alibi is flimsy. He could easily have slipped out of his room. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing. But a clue so obvious is rarely the truth. Consider, Captain, why a handkerchief would be left in the shrubbery, where it was certain to be found, and why monogrammed. It is almost too convenient. Before Hastings could respond, the library door opened, and Clara Langley entered, her face pale and her hands trembling. She hesitated, then approached Miss Marple, her voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you. Alone, if you please." Hastings, ever the gentleman, excused himself, though his curiosity was plain. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and gestured for Clara to sit. "My dear, you look distressed. What is it?" Clara's eyes darted to the door, ensuring they were alone. "It's about Sylvia," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't tell the inspector everything. Last night, before dinner, she came to my room. She was agitated. She said she'd uncovered something about someone here. She wouldn't say who, but she told me she'd written it in her notebook. She said it was dangerous, and that if anything happened to her, I should look for it." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, but her mind sharpened. "Did she give you any hint, Miss Langley, of what this secret was? A name, perhaps, or a motive?" Clara shook her head, tears welling. "No, she was too frightened. She said she'd been watching someone, and that they knew it. I thought she was being dramatic. But now, oh, Miss Marple, what if she's dead because of me?" "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple said firmly, patting Clara's hand. "You are not to blame, but you must be brave and tell me everything. Did you see anyone near her room before the scream?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. I saw Mr. Hammond in the corridor just before dinner. He was coming from the direction of Sylvia's room. He said he'd been looking for the library, but it seemed odd. The library is in the opposite wing." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Very interesting. Thank you, Miss Langley. You've been most helpful. Now, dry your eyes and say nothing of this to anyone, not yet." As Clara left, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind turning over this new information. Victor Hammond, with his sharp tongue and evasive answers, was emerging as a figure of interest. She recalled his barbed comments at dinner about family, secrets, and his dismissive attitude toward Sylvia's disappearance. Could he have known what Sylvia was writing? And if so, what had he done to silence her? Hastings returned, his face eager. "Any luck, Miss Marple?" "A small thread, Captain," she replied, her voice soft, but threads lead to patterns. "I think it's time we spoke with Mr. Hammond ourselves." They found the barrister in the billiard room, idly chalking a cue as if the events of the day were of no consequence. His smirk returned as he saw them approach. Well, the amateur detectives," he said, leaning against the table. "Come to grill me, have you?" Miss Marple smiled, unruffled. "Merely a chat, Mr. Hammond. You were quite close to Miss Crane, were you not? I recall you speaking with her at length during tea." Hammond shrugged, his eyes glinting. "She was amusing, in her way, always spinning tales. But I hardly knew her." "Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively mild, "you were seen near her room before dinner. A curious place to be for someone looking for the library." Hammond's smirk faltered, and for a moment, his composure slipped. "Who told you that?" he demanded, then caught himself. "I mean, yes, I was in the corridor. I got turned around in this maze of a house. Nothing sinister about it, of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes never leaving his. "But Miss Crane's notebook, did she ever show it to you? Perhaps a page or two about betrayal?" Hammond's hand tightened on the cue, but he forced a laugh. You're barking up the wrong tree. Miss Marple, I'm a barrister, not a character in one of her melodramas. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a game to finish. As he turned away, Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Hastings. He's nervous, Hastings whispered. Did you see his hand? I saw more than that, Miss Marple replied. I saw a man who knows more than he admits. But we must be patient, Captain. The truth will surface, as it always does. As the afternoon waned, Inspector Hargreaves announced that the handkerchief had traces of blood matching the stain in Sylvia's room, though no further clues had emerged. The guests retired to their rooms, their alibis scrutinized but unproven, their secrets simmering beneath the surface. Miss Marple, returning to her own room, paused at her window, her gaze falling on the rose garden below. A single petal, caught in a thorn, fluttered in the breeze, a small detail, but one that reminded her that even the most carefully laid plans could leave a trace. Chapter 6. A clue in the details. Late afternoon light bathed Blackthorn Hall in a soft, amber glow, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over its inhabitants. The guests, confined to the house by Inspector Hargreaves' orders, moved restlessly between the drawing room, library, and conservatory, their polite facades fraying under the strain of the ongoing investigation. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat in the library, with a cup of tea, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm that belied the rapid workings of her mind. Captain Hastings, ever her faithful shadow, stood by the window, watching the grounds where police constables were still searching for signs of Sylvia Crane. The handkerchief with the monogrammed L had become the focal point of the investigation, with Inspector Hargreaves leaning heavily on Lawrence Kendall as a suspect. Kendall, however, maintained his composure, insisting the handkerchief was not his and suggesting it might belong to Lady Beatrice or Clara Langley. Miss Marple, while intrigued by Kendall's elusive presence, was not convinced the handkerchief was the key to the mystery. It was too obvious, too neatly placed, like a prop in one of Sylvia's novels. Her thoughts kept returning to the notebook, the word betrayal, and the faint smudge of wax on the desk detail. That seemed to whisper of something more deliberate. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small object on the library table, a silver cigarette case, engraved with the initials P.W. It belonged to Peter Walsh, the young cousin, who had left it behind after a nervous conversation with Hastings earlier. She recalled Peter's trembling hands at breakfast, his reluctance to meet anyone's gaze, and his vague alibi about fetching water during the critical moments before Sylvia's scream. There was something about the young man, his boyish charm, masking a deeper unease that piqued her curiosity. "Captain Hastings," she said softly, beckoning him over. "Do you recall what Mr. Walsh said about his movements last night? He was at the sideboard, fetching water, was he not?" Hastings nodded, consulting his notebook. "Yes, that's right. He said he was thirsty and went to the sideboard just before 9 p.m., but the sideboard's in plain view of the dining room. Several people confirmed he was there, though no one can say exactly when he stepped away." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "And yet, Captain, a sideboard is such a convenient place to linger, is it not? One might stand there, unnoticed, and observe or even slip away for a moment without drawing attention." Hastings' eyes widened. "You think Peter's involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but precise, "that everyone is involved, in their way. But Mr. Walsh's nervousness intrigues me. Let us speak with him, shall we?" They found Peter in the billiard room, alone, staring at the green felt table as if it held the answers to his troubles. His face, pale and drawn, brightened briefly at the sight of Hastings, but his eyes flickered warily toward Miss Marple. "Good afternoon," he said, forcing a smile. "Any news about Sylvia?" "Nothing new, I'm afraid," Hastings replied, his tone kind but probing. "But we were hoping you could clarify something. Mr. Walsh, you mentioned being at the sideboard last night. Did you notice anything unusual, perhaps someone leaving the dining room, or a sound from upstairs?" Peter's hands fidgeted, and he reached for his cigarette case, only to realize it was missing. I don't recall anything specific," he said, his voice unsteady. "It was all so ordinary until that scream. I was just getting water, as I said." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was sharp. "Of course, Mr. Walsh. But you seem troubled. Young men like yourself often carry burdens they feel they cannot share. If there's anything you know about Miss Crane, perhaps, or her notebook, it might help us find her." Peter's face flushed, and for a moment, it seemed he might speak. But then he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't know anything," he said, almost too quickly. "Sylvia was. She was always writing, always watching people. Maybe she saw something she shouldn't have, but I don't know what." As he excused himself, Miss Marple noted the way his hands shook as he lit a cigarette from a borrowed case. "A nervous young man," she murmured to Hastings, "and one who knows more than he admits. But he is not alone in that." Their next stop was the East Wing, where Sylvia's room remained under police guard. Inspector Hargreaves had allowed Miss Marple and Hastings to examine it again, provided they disturbed nothing. As they entered, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the desk, where the notebook still lay open. She bent closer, her fingers hovering over the page with the word betrayal and the time 8:45 p.m. The wax smudge, she now saw, was not random. It formed a faint crescent, as if a candle had been tilted and dripped. "Captain," she said, pointing to the mark, "this is no accident. Someone used a candle in this room, and recently. Yet there are no candles here now, only electric lamps. Why would a candle be needed, unless to conceal one's presence in the dark?" Hastings frowned, peering at the smudge. "You think someone was here before the scream, sneaking about?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "And consider the scratch on the desk, a heavy object, dragged in haste, and the earring left near the bed. These are not the signs of a planned disappearance, but of something interrupted." As they left the room, they encountered Eleanor Grayson in the corridor, her sharp features set in a scowl. "Still poking about, Miss Marple," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "You'll find nothing but Sylvia's flair for drama. She's probably hiding somewhere, laughing at us all." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Perhaps, Mrs. Grayson. But tell me, did you know Miss Crane well? Her novels, I understand, were quite revealing." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "I read one or two. Trashy stuff, full of scandal." She thought herself clever, digging into people's lives. "If she's gone, it's her own doing." The venom in her words was unmistakable, and Miss Marple filed it away, along with the memory of Eleanor's trembling hands the previous night. As they parted, Hastings whispered, "She's got a motive, hasn't she? If Sylvia's novel exposed something about her, or about someone she protects." Miss Marple finished, "We must be patient, Captain. The truth is like a tapestry, each thread must be placed just so." By evening, Inspector Hargreaves gathered the guests in the drawing room to report a new development. A groundskeeper had found a torn scrap of paper near the rose garden, bearing the words "Meet me at 8:45. The handwriting matched Sylvia's notebook. The room erupted in murmurs, with accusations flying toward Kendall, whose alibi remained unverified. Miss Marple, however, remained silent, her mind turning to the candle wax, the earring, and the nervous glances of Peter Walsh. The red herrings were multiplying, but she was beginning to see the shape of the truth, hidden beneath the surface of Blackthorn Hall's polished facade. Chapter 7. The lies unraveled. Evening shadows lengthened across Blackthorn Hall, casting intricate patterns on the oak-paneled walls of the drawing room, where the guests had gathered once more. The discovery of the torn note, "Meet me at 8:45, had intensified the air of suspicion, and Inspector Hargreaves' stern presence did little to ease the tension. The guests sat in uneasy silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, each avoiding the other's eyes as if fearful of revealing too much. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped and her knitting needles moving with quiet precision, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of serenity and sharpness. Captain Hastings, seated beside her, scribbled furiously in his notebook, his brow furrowed with the effort of keeping pace with the unfolding mystery. Inspector Hargreaves held up the scrap of paper, its edges ragged, as if torn in haste. "This note," he declared, his voice gruff, "was found near the rose garden, and its handwriting matches Miss Crane's notebook. It suggests she arranged a meeting just before her disappearance. I want to know who she was meeting and why." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor Hammond, the barrister, leaned back in his chair, his smirk barely concealing a flicker of unease. "A secret rendezvous," he said, his tone mocking. "Sounds like one of Sylvia's novels. Perhaps she was meeting a lover or a blackmailer." Lady Beatrice Langley stiffened, her pearl necklace glinting as she turned to him. "That's quite enough, Mr. Hammond," she said sharply. "Sylvia was a guest in our home, and I won't have her memory slandered." Clara Langley, seated beside her mother, looked down at her hands, her face pale. Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twisted the lace of her dress, a gesture of distress she had seen before. Peter Walsh, meanwhile, seemed to shrink further into his chair, his eyes darting toward the door as if longing to escape. Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles, while Eleanor Grayson's lips curved in a thin, disdainful smile. Lawrence Kendall, the latecomer, sat apart, his dark eyes unreadable, though Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw when the note was mentioned. Miss Marple's needles paused as she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, might I see the note? Sometimes the smallest details reveal the most." Hargreaves, though initially skeptical of her involvement, handed her the scrap with a grudging nod. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting the hurried script and the faint smudge of ink at the edge, similar to the wax mark on Sylvia's desk. The paper was of fine quality, matching the notebook, but what caught her eye was a tiny crease, as if it had been folded tightly before being torn. She returned it to the inspector, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. "Captain Hastings," she murmured, leaning toward him, "do you recall the wax smudge in Miss Crane's room? This note bears a similar mark, faint, but unmistakable. I suspect it was written in haste, perhaps by candlelight, and concealed before it was torn." Hastings' eyes widened. "You think she wrote it to someone in the house? But who?" "That," Miss Marple said, her voice low, "is what we must discover." And we must also consider why the note was left where it could be found, a careless mistake, or a deliberate clue. As the inspector resumed his questioning, Miss Marple's attention turned to the guests' alibis, which were growing increasingly frayed. Sir Reginald claimed he had been in the dining room, but admitted to stepping out briefly to check on a delivery at 8:40 p.m. Lady Beatrice said she had been speaking with the butler, Mr. Burrows, about the wine selection, though Burrows later confessed the conversation had ended by 8:30. Clara's claim of visiting the powder room was unverified, and Dr. Grayson's trip to fetch a headache powder placed him near the east wing. At the critical time, Eleanor, who insisted she was with her husband, could not account for a 5-minute gap when she had stepped away to adjust her dress. Victor Hammond's assertion that he never left the dining room was contradicted by Clara's sighting of him in the corridor, and Peter Walsh's sideboard alibi was vague at best. Lawrence Kendall, still the enigma, maintained he was in his room, but no one could confirm it. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden outburst from Eleanor Grayson. "This is absurd," she snapped, rising from her chair. "You're all chasing shadows." Sylvia was a meddler, always poking into other people's affairs. "If she's gone, it's because she pushed someone too far. Why don't you ask Mr. Kendall about his late rival? Or Mr. Walsh, who's been shaking like a leaf since last night?" Peter flushed scarlet, his hands clenching. "I've done nothing wrong," he protested, his voice cracking. "I barely knew Sylvia." "Then why are you so nervous, boy?" Eleanor retorted, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Enough," Sir Reginald roared, slamming his fist on the arm of his chair. "This bickering gets us nowhere. Inspector, do your job and find Miss Crane." Hargreaves, unruffled, announced that he would conduct private interviews with each guest to verify their alibis. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple approached Clara, who lingered near the fireplace, her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Langley," she said gently, "you mentioned Sylvia's fear about her novel. Did she ever speak of anyone in this house, perhaps someone she suspected of a secret?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, She mentioned a name once, in passing. She said she'd seen something in the village, something about Dr. Grayson, but she wouldn't tell me more. She said it was too dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging this revelation. Dr. Grayson, with his nervous tics and vague alibi, was another thread in the tapestry. She thanked Clara and rejoined Hastings, who was waiting in the hall. "Dr. Grayson," Hastings said, incredulous. "He seems harmless enough, but that headache powder story is thin. And Eleanor's so quick to deflect. Do you think she's covering for him? Or for herself?" Miss Marple replied, "But we must also consider the note. Meet me at 8:45. It suggests Sylvia had a purpose, a plan, and the wax smudge links it to her room, where something or someone interrupted her. As night fell, Miss Marple returned to her room. Her knitting resumed as she sat by the window. The rose garden below was shrouded in darkness, but she could still see the single petal caught in a thorn, a reminder of the delicate balance of truth and deception. The lies were unraveling, one by one, and she sensed that the next revelation would bring them closer to the heart of the mystery, or to a trap laid by a cunning hand. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Air in Blackthorn Hall had grown stifling by the second evening, as if the walls themselves were closing in under the weight of unspoken truths. The guests, confined by Inspector Hargreaves' ongoing investigation, moved through the grand rooms with the wariness of actors in a play they did not fully understand. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat in the conservatory, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the strained interactions of the household. Captain Hastings, ever attentive, stood nearby, his notebook now a tangle of theories and question marks, his frustration palpable. The discovery of the note, "Meet me at 8:45, had deepened the mystery, and the monogrammed handkerchief had only fueled suspicion, particularly toward Lawrence Kendall, whose elusive demeanor made him an easy target. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen insight into human nature, suspected the truth lay not in the obvious clues, but in the quieter, more personal moments that revealed the heart's secrets. She had seen such moments before, in the village intrigues of St. Mary's Mead, where a glance or a hesitation could unravel a carefully woven lie. As the evening progressed, the tension reached a breaking point. Dinner had been a subdued affair, with Sir Reginald's forced joviality failing to mask the unease that hung over the table. Clara Langley, pale and silent, barely touched her food, her eyes darting toward her mother as if seeking reassurance or answers. Dr. Grayson's nervous fidgeting had grown more pronounced, while Eleanor Grayson's sharp tongue was uncharacteristically restrained. Victor Hammond maintained his air of detachment, though Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed lightly on the tablecloth. Peter Walsh, meanwhile, seemed on the verge of collapse, his boyish face haggard, his hands trembling. As he reached for his wine glass, it was after dinner, in the drawing room, that the dam broke. Inspector Hargreaves had just announced that the police had found a new clue, a single pearl earring, identical to the one in Sylvia's room, caught in the hem of a curtain in the East Wing corridor. The discovery suggested that Sylvia or someone carrying her earring had been in the corridor just before the scream. The news sent a shockwave through the group, and Peter Walsh, already pale, suddenly stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I can't do this anymore," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. I know something, and I can't keep it to myself any longer." The room fell silent, all eyes on the young man. Lady Beatrice's hand froze on her teacup. Sir Reginald's mustache twitched, and even Victor Hammond's smirk vanished. Miss Marple, her needles still, leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "Mr. Walsh," she said gently, "whatever you know, it is best to share it now. The truth has a way of coming to light, and it is kinder when it comes willingly." Peter's shoulders slumped, and he ran a trembling hand through his hair. "It's about Sylvia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She came to me 2 days ago, before the weekend began. She said she'd found something about the Langleys. She wouldn't tell me what, but she was scared. She said she'd written it in her notebook, and that if anything happened to her, I should tell someone I trusted. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Lady Beatrice's face hardened. "What nonsense is this?" she demanded. "What could Sylvia possibly have known about our family?" Peter hesitated, his eyes darting to Clara, then to the floor. "It was about money," he said at last. "She hinted that someone was in financial trouble, serious trouble. She said she'd seen documents in the village, at the bank, when she was researching her novel. I didn't believe her at first, but she was so insistent." Sir Reginald's face reddened, and he slammed his fist on the arm of his chair. "Preposterous. Our finances are none of that woman's business. This is slander, pure and simple." Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Sir Reginald, noting the vein pulsing at his temple. "And yet, Sir Reginald," she said mildly, "Miss Crane's notebook does mention betrayal, and her fear was evident to others. Perhaps Mr. Walsh's account is not so far-fetched." Peter sank back into his chair, his face ashen. "I should have said something sooner," he whispered, "but I was afraid." Sylvia said the truth could ruin someone, maybe more than one person. And now she's gone. The room erupted in murmurs, with Eleanor Grayson's voice rising above the rest. "This is absurd," she snapped. Sylvia was a fantasist, spinning tales to sell her books. If she poked her nose into someone's affairs, she brought this on herself. Dr. Grayson, his voice unsteady, tried to calm his wife. "Eleanor, please. This isn't helping." Miss Marple, however, was watching Lawrence Kendall, who had remained silent throughout Peter's outburst. His dark eyes were fixed on the young man, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, anger, perhaps, or fear cross his face. She made a mental note to speak with him privately, for his absence during the critical hours and his missing cufflink were threads she could not yet place. Then Inspector Hargreaves seized the moment to press Peter further. "Mr. Walsh, did Miss Crane name anyone specifically, or give you any proof of these so-called documents?" Peter shook his head, his voice barely audible. "No. She just said to watch out for someone close to the family. Someone who wasn't what they seemed." The inspector grunted, clearly frustrated, but Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities. Peter's confession, while vague, had cracked the facade of the household, exposing raw nerves and hidden motives. The mention of financial trouble pointed toward Sir Reginald, whose bluster about temporary setbacks at tea now seemed more significant. But Clara's distress, Dr. Grayson's nervousness, and Eleanor's defensiveness suggested other secrets, perhaps intertwined. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple caught Clara's eye and offered a reassuring nod. "Courage, my dear," she murmured. "The truth is a heavy burden, but it is lighter when shared." Later, in the quiet of her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting forgotten as she pieced together the fragments. The note, the earring, the wax smudge, the handkerchief, and now Peter's revelation about financial secrets, all were threads in a tapestry that was beginning to take shape. She thought of Sylvia's fear, of the word betrayal, and of the unseen figure in the corridor. Someone in Blackthorn Hall had acted to silence her, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who and why. Chapter 9. The trap is set. Third morning at Blackthorn Hall dawned with a heavy mist that clung to the estate's rolling lawns, shrouding the rose garden and the gravel drive in a veil of uncertainty. The atmosphere inside was no less oppressive, as the guests moved through their routines with the wariness of chess pieces, anticipating a checkmate. Peter Walsh's emotional confession the previous evening had fractured the fragile civility of the group, and accusations now simmered beneath every glance and whispered conversation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the conservatory with her knitting, observed the shifting dynamics with her usual quiet intensity, her needles clicking like a metronome to her thoughts. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, stood nearby, his notebook now a labyrinth of clues and contradictions. Inspector Hargreaves, emboldened by Peter's revelation, had intensified his inquiries, focusing on Sir Reginald Langley's financial troubles and Lawrence Kendall's elusive alibi. The monogrammed handkerchief and the torn note, "Meet me at 8:45, remained the cornerstones of his investigation. But Miss Marple suspected they were diversions, carefully placed to obscure the truth. Her mind kept returning to the smaller details: the wax smudge on Sylvia's desk, the single pearl earring, the scratch on the desk, and Peter's nervous admission about Sylvia's discovery of financial secrets. These were the threads that would lead to the heart of the mystery, she was certain, if only she could weave them together. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple proposed a plan to Hastings, her voice low and deliberate. Captain, we must apply a little pressure to our suspects. People reveal themselves when they feel the net closing. I suggest we gather everyone this evening and ask a few pointed questions, nothing accusatory, mind you, but enough to stir the pot. Hastings' eyes lit up. You mean to set a trap, Miss Marple, like Poirot with his grand reveals? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not quite so theatrical, perhaps, but similar in spirit. We shall observe their reactions. Captain, the guilty will always betray themselves if you know where to look. With Inspector Hargreaves' reluctant approval, Miss Marple arranged for the guests to gather in the drawing room after dinner. She spent the day quietly observing, slipping into conversations. With the precision of a needle threading silk, she spoke first with Dr. Grayson, whose nervous tics had grown more pronounced. Dr. Grayson, she said, her tone kindly, you mentioned fetching a headache powder before the scream. Did you pass anyone in the corridor on your way? The doctor adjusted his spectacles, his face flushing. No one, I think. It was all so quick. I was only gone a moment. Miss Marple nodded, noting the hesitation in his voice. She then approached Eleanor Grayson, who was arranging flowers in the hall with a vigor that suggested she was avoiding something or someone. Mrs. Grayson, Miss Marple said, you seem convinced Miss Crane staged her disappearance. Yet, her fear was evident to others. Did she ever speak to you about her novel? Perhaps something that troubled her? Eleanor's lips tightened. She was always scribbling nonsense. She snapped. If she got herself into trouble, it's no surprise. People who pry into others' lives rarely fare well. The venom in her words was telling, and Miss Marple filed it away. She next sought out Lawrence Kendall, who was reading in the library, his dark eyes lifting as she approached. Mr. Kendall, she said, your late rival has caused some speculation. Might I ask why you chose to join us so late, and why you retired immediately to your room? Kendall's expression remained impassive, though his fingers tightened slightly on his book. I had business in London, he said smoothly. The train was delayed, and I was tired. I had no reason to join the others until morning. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes sharp. And yet, a man of your observance must have noticed something that night. A sound, perhaps, or a glimpse of someone in the corridor. Kendall met her gaze, his voice cool. I heard nothing, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I'm of little help. His deflection was too polished, and Miss Marple made a mental note of it. As the day waned, she and Hastings reviewed the alibis once more, cross-referencing times and locations. The gaps were narrowing, but the truth remained elusive. That evening, the drawing room was a stage set for revelation. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the assembled guests. Inspector Hargreaves stood by the mantel, his notebook in hand, while Miss Marple sat unobtrusively in her corner, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the tension. Hastings, at her side, watched the group with eager anticipation. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple began, her voice soft but commanding attention. We are gathered to clarify certain matters regarding Miss Crane's disappearance. Each of you has offered an alibi, but there are inconsistencies that trouble me. Let us consider the note. Meet me at 8:45. It suggests Miss Crane had a purpose, a meeting with someone in this house. I wonder, who among you received such a note, or perhaps saw Miss Crane writing it? A heavy silence followed. Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his face reddening. This is absurd. None of us would have reason to meet her secretly. And yet, Miss Marple continued, her eyes sweeping the room. Someone did. The wax smudge on her desk suggests a candle was used, perhaps to avoid detection. The earring in the corridor, the scratch on the desk, these are signs of a struggle, or perhaps a hasty exit. And then there's the matter of her notebook, with the word betrayal. Miss Crane knew something, and someone in this room feared what she knew. Clara Langley gasped, her hand clutching her mother's arm. Peter Walsh's face drained of color, and Dr. Grayson's spectacles slipped down his nose. Eleanor Grayson's eyes narrowed, while Victor Hammond's smirk returned, though it was strained. Lawrence Kendall remained still, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple as if measuring her. "Miss Marple," Lady Beatrice said sharply, "you overstep. These are wild accusations, with no proof." "Not accusations, Lady Beatrice," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Merely observations. For instance, I observed that Mr. Hammond was seen near Miss Crane's room before dinner, despite claiming to be in the dining room. And Mr. Walsh, you spoke of Miss Crane's fear of financial secrets that might point to Sir Reginald, or perhaps another." The room erupted in protests, with Sir Reginald bellowing and Eleanor Grayson snapping at Peter. But Miss Marple's eyes were on Kendall, who had risen silently from his chair. "Enough," he said, his voice low but firm. "I tire of this charade. If you must know, I saw Sylvia that night, in the corridor, just before 8:45. She was agitated, clutching her notebook. She said she needed to speak with me, but I told her to wait until morning. I didn't take her seriously." The admission stunned the room into silence. Inspector Hargreaves stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "And why didn't you mention this before, Mr. Kendall?" Kendall's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't want to be dragged into this mess. But I swear, I left her there and returned to my room." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a quiet signal that the trap had worked. Kendall's confession, while partial, had shifted the balance, exposing a crack in the facade. The truth was closer now, but the final piece of the puzzle remained just out of reach. Chapter 10. The revealed drawing room of Blackthorn Hall was a crucible of tension, the firelight casting long shadows that seemed to writhe with the secrets of its occupants. Lawrence Kendall's admission that he had seen Sylvia Crane in the corridor just before her disappearance had sent a shockwave through the gathered guests, their faces a tableau of shock, suspicion, and barely concealed fear. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting needles still, her shawl neatly draped, observed the scene with the calm precision of a watchmaker assembling a delicate mechanism. Captain Hastings, beside her, gripped his notebook, his eyes darting from face to face, sensing that the moment of truth was near. Inspector Hargreaves, his stout frame looming by the mantel, fixed Kendall with a stern gaze. "Mr. Kendall," he said, his voice heavy with authority, "you've admitted to seeing Miss Crane at a critical moment, yet you kept this from us. Why should we believe you left her unharmed?" Kendall's dark eyes flickered, but his voice remained steady. "Because it's the truth, Inspector. I had no reason to harm Sylvia. She was agitated, yes, but I told her to wait until morning. I went to my room and heard nothing until the scream." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but piercing. "Mr. Kendall," she said gently, "you say Miss Crane was clutching her notebook. Did she mention its contents? Perhaps a word, betrayal, for instance?" Kendall hesitated, his composure faltering for the first time. She said something about uncovering a truth that would shock everyone, but she wouldn't elaborate. I thought it was just her flair for drama." The The room stirred with murmurs of disbelief and accusation. Sir Reginald Langley's face reddened, his mustache bristling. "This is preposterous," he roared. Sylvia was meddling in things she didn't understand. Financial troubles. Indeed, our family's affairs are private. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to Sir Reginald, then to Clara, whose hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Peter Walsh, still pale from his earlier confession, stared at the floor, while Dr. Grayson adjusted his spectacles nervously. Eleanor Grayson's lips were pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting toward her husband. Victor Hammond, his smirk gone, leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice rising just enough to command attention, "if I may. I believe we are close to understanding what happened to Miss Crane. But to do so, we must piece together the threads of this mystery, each clue, each contradiction, each moment of fear or deceit." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Hastings leaned closer, his anticipation palpable. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Let us begin with the facts. Miss Crane disappeared at approximately 9 p.m. After a scream was heard. Her room was locked, the window open, a small blood stain on the floor, and a single pearl earring left behind. Her notebook bore the word betrayal and the time 8:45 p.m., with a smudge of wax and a scratch on the desk. A note, "Meet me at 8:45, was found in the rose garden, and a monogrammed handkerchief in the shrubbery. These are our clues, and they tell a story." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Miss Crane was afraid. She had uncovered a secret, something about financial ruin. As Mr. Walsh confirmed, she hinted to Miss Langley that it involved someone close to the family, and to Mr. Kendall that it would shock everyone. Her novel, she said, was based on truth, too much truth. I believe she arranged to meet someone that night, someone she trusted, to confront them with what she knew. But that meeting went terribly wrong. Clara Langley gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You mean she was betrayed?" "Precisely." Miss Marple said, "Let us consider the alibis." Sir Reginald was briefly absent, checking a delivery. Lady Beatrice spoke with the butler. But earlier than she claimed, Clara was in the powder room. Unverified. Dr. Grayson fetched a headache powder, and Mrs. Grayson was briefly alone. Mr. Hammond was seen near Sylvia's room, despite his claims. Mr. Walsh was at the sideboard, but his timing is vague. And Mr. Kendall, alone in his room, saw Sylvia at 8:45. Each of you had opportunity, and each, I suspect, has a motive. Eleanor Grayson bristled. "This is outrageous. You're accusing." "You all." "Not accusing," Miss Marple said calmly. "Observing. Let us turn to the clues." The wax smudge suggests a candle was used in Sylvia's room, despite the electric lamps. Why? To avoid detection, perhaps by someone who did not wish to be seen. The scratch on the desk indicates a heavy object was moved, perhaps a suitcase, or something else. The earring in the corridor suggests Sylvia was there. But why leave one behind? And the note, why was it torn and left in the garden? These are not accidents, but a narrative. She leaned forward, her voice steady. "I propose that Sylvia arranged to meet someone she trusted, someone who betrayed her. That person entered her room, perhaps through the unlocked door, and a struggle ensued. The blood stain suggests a minor injury, perhaps a cut. The window was opened to suggest an escape, but Sylvia did not leave that way. There are no marks below. Instead, she was taken elsewhere, and the earring, the note, and The handkerchief were left to mislead us. Inspector Hargreaves frowned. Taken where? Miss Marple. We've searched the grounds. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Not far, Inspector. I believe Sylvia is still in this house. And I believe the key lies with Dr. Grayson. The room erupted. In gasps, Dr. Grayson's spectacles slipped, and Eleanor leapt to her feet. How dare you? She cried. My husband is a respected physician. Indeed, Miss Marple said, unruffled, which is why he was the perfect person to stage this disappearance. Dr. Grayson, your alibi is weak, and your nervousness betrays you. Sylvia uncovered something about you, perhaps a professional indiscretion, or a financial one, tied to the Langleys' troubles. You met her at 8:45, as her note requested. There was a struggle, and you subdued her, perhaps with a sedative from your medical bag. The scratch on the desk was from that bag, and the wax smudge from a candle you used to avoid detection. You hid her in the house, perhaps in a locked room or attic, and planted the note and handkerchief to point to Mr. Kendall. Dr. Grayson's face turned ashen. This is nonsense, he stammered. But Eleanor's eyes widened, and she gripped his arm, her voice low. Harold, tell her she's wrong. He shook his head, his voice breaking. I didn't mean to hurt her. She knew about the loans I arranged for Sir Reginald, loans from unsavory sources. She was going to expose me in her novel. I only meant to talk, but she fought, and I panicked. She's alive, in the attic, sedated. I couldn't let her ruin me. The room exploded in chaos, but Miss Marple remained calm, her trap sprung. Sylvia was found, shaken but alive, and Dr. Grayson was taken into custody. The truth, as always, had emerged from the quiet details, woven together by a mind that saw what others missed. Chapter 11. The reflection the morning mist had lifted from Blackthorn Hall, revealing a landscape bathed in pale sunlight, as if the estate itself were exhaling after the turmoil of the past days. The revelation of Dr. Grayson's guilt had left the household in a state of subdued shock, with Sylvia Crane, pale but recovering, now resting under the care of a local nurse in one of the guest rooms. Inspector Hargreaves had taken Dr. Grayson into custody, his stern efficiency softened by a grudging respect for Miss Jane Marple's unerring insight. The guests, their secrets laid bare, moved through the grand rooms with a quiet unease, their glances avoiding one another as they prepared to depart. Miss Marple sat in the conservatory, her knitting needles clicking softly, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. The ferns and potted orchids around her seemed to mirror her calm, their green fronds still in the morning air. Captain Hastings, his notebook finally closed, joined her, his face a mixture of admiration and exhaustion. Miss Marple, he said, settling into a wicker chair, you've done it again. I don't know how you saw through it all, the wax, the earring, the note. It was like watching a magician pull a rabbit from a hat. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. No magic, Captain Hastings, only observation. People are much like my knitting. You see, each stitch must be placed just so, or the pattern unravels. Dr. Grayson's stitches were loose, and his fear betrayed him. Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity undimmed. But how did you know? It was him. The handkerchief pointed to Kendall, and Peter's confession about financial secrets seemed to implicate Sir Reginald. Even I thought Hammond was suspicious, with his sneaking about the corridor. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered her response. It was a matter of seeing the whole pattern, Captain. The handkerchief was too obvious, a clumsy attempt to shift blame to Mr. Kendall, whose late rival made him an easy scapegoat. Peter's revelation about financial troubles was true, but it was a distraction. Sylvia's discovery was not about Sir Reginald's debts, but about Dr. Grayson's role in arranging them through disreputable means. As for Mr. Hammond, his presence in the corridor was suspicious, but his motive was curiosity, not malice. He, too, suspected Sylvia knew something, but he was merely prying, not plotting. She resumed her knitting, her voice soft but precise. The real clues were the small ones. The wax smudge on the desk told me someone used a candle to avoid detection. Dr. Grayson, who knew the house well and could navigate in the dark. The scratch on the desk suggested his medical bag, heavy with instruments, was dragged in haste. The earring in the corridor indicated Sylvia had been moved. And the note, "Meet me at 8:45, was not a lure, but a desperate attempt by Sylvia to confront Dr. Grayson about what she knew. He panicked, subdued her, and staged the scene to suggest an escape through the window. Hastings shook his head, marveling. And the blood stain? Was that part of the staging? A minor injury, Miss Marple said. Perhaps a cut from the struggle, or even a deliberate touch to add to the drama. Dr. Grayson is a physician. He knew how to create the appearance of violence without causing serious harm. But his mistake was underestimating Sylvia's resilience and the power of her notebook. The word betrayal was her warning, and it pointed directly to him. As they spoke, Clara Langley entered the conservatory, her face still pale but softened by relief. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't thank you enough. Sylvia told me this morning that you saved her life. If you hadn't seen through it all—" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression kind. "My dear, I only did what anyone might, given a little patience and attention. You helped, you know, by sharing Sylvia's fears. Courage is a powerful thing, Miss Langley." Clara managed a small smile before excusing herself, leaving Miss Marple and Hastings alone again. The captain leaned back, his eyes distant. "It's a grim business, though. Dr. Grayson seemed so ordinary, a respected man, hiding such a secret. It makes you wonder who you can trust." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "That, Captain, is the heart of it. People are rarely what they seem, but their actions, however small, reveal their truth. In my village, I have seen it time and again. A kind word masking envy, a smile hiding fear. One must simply watch and listen." Hastings chuckled. "You make it sound so simple, Miss Marple, but I'll wager there's no one in St. Mary's Mead with your knack for it." She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "Oh, you'd be surprised, Captain. Human nature is the same everywhere, whether in a village or a grand estate like this. It is only a matter of seeing the pattern." As the morning wore on, the guests began to depart, their farewells subdued. Sir Reginald, his bluster tempered by the scandal, shook Miss Marple's hand with gruff gratitude. Lady Beatrice, her composure restored, offered a formal thank you, though her eyes betrayed a lingering worry about the family's reputation. Victor Hammond left with a curt nod, his smirk absent, while Peter Walsh, still shaken, promised to visit Sylvia in her recovery. Lawrence Kendall, his mystery unresolved but his role in the affair minor, slipped away quietly, his black Daimler disappearing down the drive. Miss Marple, her suitcase packed, stood on the steps of Blackthorn Hall, her gaze lingering on the rose garden where a single petal still clung to a thorn. Inspector Hargreaves approached, his expression one of reluctant admiration. "Miss Marple," he said, "I'll admit, I doubted you at first, but you've got a mind sharper than most of my men. If you ever tire of knitting, Scotland Yard could use you." She laughed softly, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, Inspector, I'm far too fond of my quiet life, but I'm glad to have been of service. Do take care of Miss Crane, she has a story to finish, I think," with a final nod to Hastings, who promised to write. Miss Marple boarded the car that would take her to the station. As Blackthorn Hall receded into the distance, she settled back, her knitting resumed, her mind already turning to the simple pleasures of St. Mary's Mead. The mystery was solved, the truth revealed, and the little grey cells, as always, had proven their worth. Chapter 12. The hidden thread train rattled steadily through the Devon countryside, carrying Miss Jane Marple away from Blackthorn Hall and back toward the familiar comforts of St. Mary's Mead. She sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, the familiar rhythm a counterpoint to the whirl of thoughts in her mind. Though the mystery of Sylvia Crane's disappearance had been resolved with Dr. Grayson's confession, Miss Marple's keen intuition told her that a single thread remained loose, a detail that nagged at her like a dropped stitch in her knitting. Captain Hastings, who had accompanied her to the station, had bid her farewell with a promise to visit, his admiration for her undimmed. Yet, as the fields rolled by, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Blackthorn Hall and the subtle inconsistencies that lingered. The case, on the surface, was neatly tied. Dr. Grayson had admitted to subduing Sylvia Crane to protect his secret involvement in Sir Reginald Langley's illicit financial dealings. The wax smudge, the scratched desk, the single pearl earring, and the staged scene in Sylvia's room had all pointed to his desperate attempt to silence her. Sylvia, recovering under medical care, had confirmed that she had confronted Dr. Grayson about documents she'd seen in the village documents linking him to a shady lender who had propped up the Langley estate. The note, "Meet me at 8:45, had been her attempt to reason with him, but his panic had led to her brief captivity. In the attic, the monogrammed handkerchief, it seemed, had indeed been a clumsy plant to implicate Lawrence Kendall, a distraction from Grayson's guilt. Yet, Miss Marple's little grey cells were restless. She recalled the fleeting glance between Clara Langley and Peter Walsh during the drawing-room confrontation, a look heavy with unspoken meaning. She thought of Victor Hammond's evasive demeanor, his presence near Sylvia's room, and his barbed remarks about family secrets. And then there was Lawrence Kendall, whose missing cufflink and late arrival still tugged at her curiosity. These were small things, perhaps, but Miss Marple knew that small things often hid larger truths. As the train slowed at a small station, she set her knitting aside and opened her handbag, retrieving a scrap of paper where she had jotted down a few notes during her final hours at Blackthorn Hall. Among them was a detail she had not shared with Inspector Hargreaves or Hastings: the faint scent of lavender in Sylvia's room, which matched the perfume Clara Langley wore. It was a trivial observation, easily dismissed, but Miss Marple had learned never to ignore such coincidences. Clara had been deeply distressed throughout the ordeal, her fear for Sylvia genuine, but her hesitation when questioned about Sylvia's novel suggested she knew more than she had revealed. Miss Marple's mind turned to Peter Walsh's nervous confession about Sylvia's discovery of financial secrets. He had pointed to the Langleys, but his eyes had lingered on Clara, as if shielding her from scrutiny. Could Clara have known about Dr. Grayson's dealings? Or was there another secret, one Sylvia had uncovered, that touched the heart of the Langley family? The train lurched forward, and Miss Marple's thoughts shifted to the earring found in the corridor. It was identical to the one in Sylvia's room, suggesting she had been moved. But why leave it behind? A struggle, perhaps. But Miss Marple wondered if it was not a deliberate active message, or a misdirection. Clara, she recalled, had been quick to confirm Sylvia's fear, yet slow to provide details. Was she protecting someone, or hiding her own involvement? By the time the train reached St. Mary's Mead, Miss Marple had resolved to write to Captain Hastings. She would ask him to inquire discreetly about Clara's movements on the night of the disappearance, particularly whether anyone had seen her near the East Wing corridor. She also wanted to know more about Lawrence Kendall's business in London. His late rival and missing cufflink were too neatly coincidental to dismiss entirely. As she stepped onto the platform, the familiar sights of her village greeted her. The tidy cottages, the church spire, the gentle hum of daily life. Yet, her mind remained at Blackthorn Hall. Piecing together the final thread, she suspected that Clara Langley, driven by loyalty or fear, had played a role in Sylvia's ordeal, perhaps not as the perpetrator, but as a witness who had chosen silence. The lavender scent, the glance with Peter, the hesitation in her story, these were the stitches that did not quite fit. Miss Marple walked home, her steps light but purposeful, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. She would write to Hastings tonight, and perhaps to Sylvia Crane, to ensure the young woman was truly safe. The case was closed, but the truth, she knew, was never fully revealed until every thread was accounted for. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and unerring eye, would not rest until the pattern was complete. Chapter 13. The scent of lavender, the familiar tranquility of St. Mary's Mead, enveloped Miss Jane Marple as she settled into her cozy sitting room. The late afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. Her knitting lay on the table, but her hands were still, her mind far from the quiet village. The mystery of Blackthorn Hall, though ostensibly solved with Dr. Grayson's confession, continued to tug at her thoughts like an unfinished row of stitches. The scent of lavender in Sylvia Crane's room, Clara Langley's hesitant revelations, and the fleeting glance between Clara and Peter Walsh were threads that refused to lie flat. Miss Marple knew that a single loose end could unravel even the most carefully woven solution. She had written to Captain Hastings the previous evening, requesting discreet inquiries about Clara's movements on the night of Sylvia's disappearance and Lawrence Kendall's activities in London. Hastings, ever reliable, had promised to investigate, and Miss Marple awaited his reply with quiet anticipation. In the meantime, she turned her attention to a letter from Sylvia Crane, delivered that morning by the postman. Sylvia, now recovering in a London hospital, expressed her gratitude and hinted at resuming her novel, though with a newfound caution. "I shall be more careful about the truths I uncover," she wrote, "for they nearly cost me everything." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on those words. Sylvia's novel, with its dangerous truths, had been the spark that ignited the events at Blackthorn Hall. Clara's claim that Sylvia had mentioned Dr. Grayson's involvement in financial misdeeds was plausible, but Miss Marple suspected there was more to the story, something tied to the Langley family itself. The scent of lavender, so distinct in Sylvia's room, pointed to Clara, who wore the same perfume. It was a small detail, but Miss Marple had learned to trust such trifles. As she sipped her tea, her thoughts returned to the East Wing corridor, where the second pearl earring had been found. The police had assumed it was dropped during a struggle, but Miss Marple wondered if it had been placed deliberately, perhaps by someone who had been in Sylvia's room after Dr. Grayson's attack. Clara, with her pale face and trembling hands, had been quick to confirm Sylvia's fear, yet reluctant to elaborate. Was she protecting someone, Peter, perhaps, or her father, or concealing her own role? A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. It was Dolly Bantry, her friend and neighbor. "Come for a chat." "Jane, you look positively distracted," Mrs. Bantry said, settling into a chair with a rustle of skirts. "Still thinking about that dreadful business at Blackthorn Hall?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You know me too well, Dolly. There is a thread I cannot quite place, and it troubles me. Tell me, have you ever known someone to keep a secret out of loyalty, even when it risks their own peace?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Oh, plenty of times. Why? Just last year, young Mary at the vicarage kept quiet about her brothers' gambling debts to spare their mother's feelings. Nearly tore her apart. Poor thing." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking. "I am thinking of a young woman at Blackthorn Hall, torn between truth and loyalty. I believe she knows more than she has said, and it may yet unravel the full story." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eager for gossip. "Do tell, Jane, who is this young woman?" But Miss Marple only smiled, her thoughts returning to Clara Langley. She recalled the girl's distress, her fleeting glances at Peter Walsh, and her hesitation when questioned about Sylvia's novel. Clara had confirmed Sylvia's mention of Dr. Grayson, but her words had been careful, almost rehearsed. Miss Marple suspected that Clara had been in Sylvia's room that night, perhaps witnessing the struggle or arriving shortly after. The lavender scent, so out of place in a room that was not Clara's, suggested her presence, and the earring in the corridor could have been a careless mistake or a deliberate signal. As evening fell, a telegram arrived from Hastings, its contents brief but illuminating. "Clara seen near East Wing 8:50 p.m. by housemaid Jenny. Kendall's London business tied to Langley estate details unclear. Will pursue." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Clara's presence in the corridor, so close to the time of the scream, was no coincidence, and Kendall's connection to the Langley estate added another layer to the mystery. Had Sylvia uncovered not only Dr. Grayson's misdeeds but something deeper, perhaps involving Clara or her family? Miss Marple resolved to write to Sylvia directly, asking about any conversations with Clara before the fateful night. She also planned to urge Hastings to investigate Kendall's business dealings further, for his missing cufflink and late rival still gnawed at her. As she penned her letters, her mind wove the threads together. The lavender scent, the earring, Clara's hesitation, Peter's nervousness, Kendall's secrecy. The pattern was emerging, and it pointed to a betrayal closer to home than Dr. Grayson's. Desperate act. She set her pen down, her eyes drifting to the window where the village lights twinkled in the dusk. The truth, she knew, was like a garden carefully tended, but with roots that ran deep and unseen. Clara Langley, she suspected, held the key to those roots, and Miss Marple would not rest until she had unearthed them. Chapter 14. The unraveling tapestry. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated Miss Jane Marple's sitting room in St. Mary's Mead, casting delicate shadows across the walls. As she sat with her knitting, her mind far from the quiet village, the mystery of Blackthorn Hall, though resolved in the eyes of Inspector Hargreaves and the guests, continued to weave its intricate pattern in her thoughts. The telegram from Captain Hastings, confirming Clara Langley's presence near the East Wing corridor at 8:50 p.m. and Lawrence Kendall's murky connection to the Langley estate, had tightened the threads of suspicion. The faint scent of lavender in Sylvia Crane's room, Clara's hesitant revelations, and the single pearl earring in the corridor were not mere details, they were stitches in a tapestry that Miss Marple was determined to complete. She had received a reply from Sylvia Crane that morning, penned in a shaky but determined hand. Sylvia wrote of her gratitude and her intention to finish her novel, though with greater caution. More crucially, she mentioned a conversation with Clara Langley on the afternoon of her disappearance. Clara seemed anxious, Sylvia wrote, and asked me not to publish anything about the Langleys' troubles. She said it would break her father's heart. I promised to consider her request, but I fear it only made her more uneasy. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered this. Clara's plea suggested she knew of her family's financial ruin perhaps, even more than Sylvia had uncovered. The lavender scent in Sylvia's room, so distinctively Clara's, placed her there at a critical moment, likely just before or after Dr. Grayson's attack. Had Clara witnessed the struggle, or had she been complicit in some way, driven by loyalty to her father or fear of exposure? The earring in the corridor, Miss Marple now believed, was no accident. It was a cry for help, dropped by Clara to signal her presence without openly betraying her role, as she sipped her tea. A second letter arrived from Hastings, its contents more revealing than the first. Kendall's London business involved a meeting with a solicitor handling Langley estate debts. He wrote, suspect he was negotiating a bailout, possibly with conditions unfavorable to Sir Reginald. Also, housemaid Jenny confirms seeing Clara near Sylvia's room at 8:50 p.m., clutching a handkerchief and looking distressed. Will await your guidance. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Kendall's involvement in the Langley finances added a new dimension to the mystery. His late rival and missing cufflink, which she had initially dismissed as peripheral, now suggested he had a stake in the affair, perhaps as a creditor or intermediary. But it was Clara who held her attention. The housemaid's sighting placed her at the scene just before the scream, and the handkerchief, possibly the monogrammed L found in the shrubbery, could have been hers, not Kendall's. Was Clara protecting her father, or had she acted to shield someone else? Perhaps Peter Walsh, whose nervous glances and vague alibi hinted at a deeper involvement. Miss Marple rose and paced her small sitting room, her mind weaving the threads together. She recalled the drawing room confrontation, where Peter's emotional outburst about Sylvia's discovery had shifted suspicion towards Sir Reginald. Yet, his eyes had lingered on Clara, as if shielding her. Clara, in turn, had been quick to confirm Sylvia's fears about Dr. Grayson, but slow to elaborate on her own knowledge. The lavender scent, the earring, the handkerchief, these pointed to Clara's presence at the heart of the mystery, not as a perpetrator, but as a silent witness torn by loyalty. She sat at her writing desk and penned a letter to Hastings, her words precise. Dear Captain, she wrote, I believe Clara Langley holds the final key. She was in Sylvia's room, likely witnessing Dr. Grayson's attack or its aftermath. The earring and handkerchief were her attempts to leave a trail without exposing herself. Question her gently, and ask about her relationship with Peter Walsh. They share a bond that may explain her silence. As for Kendall, confirm his role in the Langley finances. I suspect he knew of Dr. Grayson's dealings and may have pressured Sir Reginald, adding to the family's strain. Yours, Jane Marple. As she sealed the letter, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the human heart, its capacity for loyalty, fear, and betrayal. Clara, she suspected, had seen Dr. Grayson subdue Sylvia and chosen to protect her family's honor. Perhaps at Peter's urging. The lavender scent was her signature, left unwittingly, and the earring her desperate signal. Kendall's role was less clear, but his cufflink and late rival suggested he was a catalyst, not the culprit. The evening deepened, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles moving with quiet assurance. The tapestry of Blackthorn Hall was nearly complete, but one final revelation awaited Clara's truth, and the bond that had kept her silent. Miss Marple knew that truth, like a garden, required patience to bloom, and she trusted Hastings to coax it forth. Chapter 15. The final stitch quiet of St. Mary's Mead was a balm to Miss Jane Marple's spirit. As she sat in her sitting room, the late morning light streaming through the lace curtains, her knitting lay untouched on the table, her hands folded as she awaited a response from Captain Hastings, to whom she had entrusted the delicate task of unraveling the final thread of the Blackthorn Hall mystery. The case, though resolved with Dr. Grayson's confession, had left a lingering question in Miss Marple's mind, a question centered on Clara Langley, the lavender scent, and the unspoken bond with Peter Walsh that had kept her silent. The tapestry of the mystery was nearly complete, but one final stitch was needed to secure the pattern. A letter arrived by the midday post, its familiar handwriting bringing a faint smile to Miss Marple's lips. Hastings, ever diligent, had followed her instructions with care, and his words confirmed her suspicions. "Dear Miss Marple," he wrote, "your intuition was, as always, spot on. I spoke with Clara Langley in London, where she is visiting Sylvia Crane. Under gentle questioning, she broke down and confessed her role. She was in Sylvia's room at 8:50 p.m., having gone to plead with her not to publish her novel. She saw Dr. Grayson enter, and when Sylvia confronted him about his shady financial dealings with Sir Reginald, a struggle ensued. Clara, frozen with fear, hid behind the door. She saw Grayson subdue Sylvia with a sedative and drag her toward the attic, his medical bag scratching the desk. Clara dropped her earring in the corridor as she fled, a subconscious cry for help. The handkerchief, monogrammed with her initial, was hers. She lost it in her panic. She kept silent to protect her father, whose financial ruin was tied to Grayson's loans, and because Peter Walsh, her secret fiancé, urged her to stay quiet to avoid scandal. Lawrence Kendall, it turns out, was a solicitor's agent pressing Sir Reginald to settle his debts, which added to the family's strain but was unrelated to Sylvia's attack. Clara is remorseful and will testify if needed. Sylvia is recovering and sends her thanks. Yours, Hastings. Miss Marple set the letter down, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. The pattern was complete. Clara Langley, torn between loyalty to her family and fear of exposure, had witnessed Dr. Grayson's desperate act but chosen silence to shield her father and Peter, whose engagement to her explained their shared glances and nervous silences. The lavender scent in Sylvia's room was Clara's unwitting signature, left as she stood frozen during the struggle. The earring and handkerchief were not deliberate clues but the traces of a young woman, caught in a moment of panic, her loyalty to her family and her love for Peter outweighing her duty to speak. She rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the tidy gardens of St. Mary's Mead. The mystery of Blackthorn Hall had been a complex weave of betrayal, fear, and hidden truths. But it was the human heart, Clara's heart, that had held the final key. Miss Marple recalled the girl's pale face, her trembling hands, and the weight of her silence. Loyalty, she knew, could be as powerful a motive as greed or fear, and Clara's love for Peter and her father had bound her to secrecy, even at great cost. Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. She thought of Sylvia Crane, whose novel had nearly cost her life, and of Dr. Grayson, whose desperation to protect his reputation had led to his downfall. Lawrence Kendall, a peripheral figure, had been a catalyst, his pressure on Sir Reginald's finances adding to the tension that Sylvia had unwittingly uncovered. Victor Hammond's sly curiosity, Eleanor Grayson's sharp defensiveness, and Peter Walsh's nervous confessions had all been threads in the tapestry. But it was Clara's silence that had nearly obscured the truth. As the afternoon sun warmed, The room, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of betrayal. Sylvia had written of it in her notebook, sensing its presence in the secrets she uncovered. Yet the true betrayal was not only Dr. Grayson's act, but Clara's silence, born of love and fear. Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the young woman, whose loyalty had placed her in an impossible position. She hoped Clara would find peace, perhaps in her future with Peter, and that Sylvia would write her novel with greater wisdom. With a final click of her needles, Miss Marple set her knitting aside. The mystery was solved, the threads woven into a complete pattern. She would write to Hastings, thanking him for his diligence, and perhaps to Clara, offering a few kind words of understanding. For now, though, she was content to sit in the quiet of her village, where the dramas of human nature played out on a smaller scale but with no less intensity. The little gray cells, as always, had found their way, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence and unerring insight, had brought the truth to light.